Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene day two of a 5-day program exploring the phenomenon of God in our postmodern world. As we begin today, I just want to note that this is the 1000th session of Humanity Rising. We've come a very long way since May of 2020, May 22nd of 2020. You'll remember, seems almost like a dim memory these days. Back in the March of 2020, the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic around the COVID-19 virus. And within a matter of a week, 2 weeks, the governments of the world in an orchestrated campaign put everybody under lockdown and in social isolation. Masks were required. Social distancing was required when you were out in public areas. And that came as a complete shock to all of us. One of the immediate conversations that we had at Ubiquity University as we were all in lockdown. I happened to be in Amsterdam at the time, and I couldn't get back to the United States because President Trump had stopped flights for that time. So I had to postpone my flight back. And we were in a global consternation. And we were thinking, how could we, in a situation of lockdown and isolation, how could we bring people together? And the idea began to percolate that, well, why don't we do a free Zoom call? Because everybody had computers, or virtually everyone did, and I could be in Amsterdam and everybody could be where they were, and we could start building a community for as long as the pandemic lasted. And at that time, we didn't know whether it was going to last for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. No one had any idea it was going to last into 2023. But we decided to really take an initiative to build community. So on May 22nd, we convened our first program. Those of you who were there will remember we had Jane Goodall and we had Lynn Twist and we had a number of women. They were all women. We did this as a way to honor the feminine healing impulse. And for the next 10 days, starting on this 22nd of May, we just heard from women's voices from all over the world. And then we heard from the voices of young people for the next 7 days. And then we started to hear from men, and then we diversified. And since then, we've had all kinds of combinations of young and old, male and female, rich and poor, white and black. And we've covered virtually every major issue of concern, with a particular focus on what we call code red issues, climate change, and the issue of war and peace, youth at risk, racism. It was in May of 2020, if you recall, that George Floyd was killed by a police officer holding his boot on his neck, the neck of George Floyd, and over 9 minutes, he was asphyxiated and died on the streets of Minneapolis. And that sparked a massive, massive public outcry. And so since George Floyd and COVID and with the various things, Ukraine and Gaza and the various other issues that have beset humanity over the last several years, we have endeavored to be there and to raise fundamental questions about why these things are transpiring, what can we do in and through all the code red issues and other issues that we have taken up. How can we, at this critical time when humanity teeters quite literally on the brink of self-destruction, how can we enable humanity to rise? How can we empower this generation, which is that generation destined by history to either make the necessary decisions to step back from the precipice and transform ourselves, or we'll make the decisions that will invite in our demise. We are the most challenged generation. We are the most fortunate generation, because out of the deep crises that surround us, opportunities are replete through the crises. And our challenge is to identify those opportunities and muster the community strength and goodwill to enable us to shape our present moment such that our children under the seventh generation will give thanks for what we have done in our time, in our watch. I want to close by thanking a few people. I think almost first and foremost, I want to thank Georg Bach, our technical director at Ubiquity University, seldom seen on Humanity Rising, because he just makes sure that it happens and has been with us day by day for this entire time. So Georg, I really want to thank you for everything that you've done. I want to thank Katie Amrin, who also day by day makes sure that the invitations get sent out, all the Zoom links get sent out, and make sure that everybody, insofar as we can, all get to the church on time. You know, in over 1,000 sessions, we've had very few misses. It's been quite extraordinary. We've been very, very richly blessed. Then on, I think it was day 60, Stan Pokris, who had been watching Humanity Rising, did an extraordinary thing. He started to convene, started to catalog all the sessions, and started to convene an after chat. So we thought, well, that's great. We have our formal sessions and we'll have an after chat. And Stan Pokris and Shannon MacArthur have been the two pillars that have made that happen. And Stan is just extraordinary. I mean, he's like an encyclopedia because you can go on his other networks .com and get all the Humanity Rising sessions, and you can look them up by speakers and sessions and all kinds of things. So I really want to thank all of you who have really come together to make sure this works, because this has been a collaborative endeavor from the very, very beginning. Because as we have said from the first session, the only way humanity is going to rise is through what we called then and we call now radical collaboration. That's what it's going to take. And then finally, and by way of introduction to our program, I really want to acknowledge and thank Tom Eddington, Dr. Tom Eddington, who over the last several years has convened, boy, I don't know, Tom, you may know the number, but Tom has been a mainstay as a partner for me among others, but Tom has done, I would say, the heavy lifting over the years now. And over the last several weeks, he's convened with various partners, and including this week. So, Tom, I just want to acknowledge you and thank you for your brilliance. And I would say the dimensional mind that you have, because you've gone into all kinds of different domains and subjects. And from you, we continue to be educated and learn of the genius of the human creativity. So thank you, everyone, for supporting Humanity Rising. We've had people register from over 130 countries from around the world. We've had hundreds of thousands of people watching over the years now. We've had live streaming partners. So it's been a great honor to be part of this endeavor at this critical moment in human history. So thank you. Welcome to Humanity Rising. And Tom, I turn the program over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It's an extraordinary community that's been developed and created over the last couple of years. And I was fortunate to learn about Humanity Rising in the 200 series of the 1,000 shows, and have had a chance to participate in lots of different ways ever since. And it's been a highlight in so many aspects and ways of my life. And part of what I love is the opportunity to meet a need I have around continuing to learn and grow. Part of it is to bring folks like my good friend Michael Putz, who has helped me put this week together, and dear friends like Michael Nagler, who's with us today. And it's just a joy to have a platform that is helping humanity rise. And I've been in an exchange with family members who are dealing with what's happening in Florida, and sort of tongue-in-cheek, we were talking about people who are choosing not to leave the path of the most recent hurricane, and unfortunately will likely be in competition to win the Darwin Award. And there's just a very strange thing about humanity that in the face of destruction, death, the shadow side of our ego wants to hold on and think that we can be in control and in charge. And what I love about Humanity Rising is it truly is an opportunity for us to rise as a species. And what I'm particularly interested in this week is the future of God, and the role that God plays in helping each of us make the right choices and be supported. And with those opening comments, I'll invite my good friend Michael Putz to come in and help us frame the day and the week, and comment on anything that came up for you yesterday, Michael, in our session with Rabbi Kat.
Yes, well, thank you, Tom. That was an extraordinary session yesterday with Rabbi Kat, and her presence was amazing, and her ability to not only share her own individual path and the work she's doing, but also help us understand the world situation at the same time. That's extraordinary. I don't expect that out of everybody, or even myself, to be able to answer for the world, answer for Gaza, answer for the Jewish people. That was extraordinary, and also really share with her spirituality. And I think some good things came out of it, because what's important, I think, about this week, and what we were talking about when we did a Future of God session before, is that we've talked about the poly crisis, and we've talked about the fact that we're all suffering. And there's a general sense of lack of shared meaning making frameworks in our culture. And it's not that, and we're not advocating any particular meaning making framework. It's just that it's difficult to cohere meaning making frameworks in our society because of the pluralism and the reaction to what Jim so eloquently said, is that there was a fusion oftentimes of spirituality, religion, and empire in the past. And there's been an evolutionary impulse in our culture for 300 years since the Enlightenment to try to separate church and state, to separate the religion from power, and also elevate reason. And those things are profound. What's happened, though, is that there's been a sense of as modernity has moved forward, and also postmodernity has moved forward, is that there's a sense of that all truth is questionable, especially ultimate truth, an ultimate truth that can help organize ourselves and help us make long-term decisions. I think Rabbi Kat talked about a lot, spirituality as being very important for her in terms of having a long view, right? And then also a belief that there is something greater than herself, and there's also the ability to take a long view that might be generations in the future. We talk about 7 generations from Native American people thinking about the future, but it's like having the ability to think that maybe what I do, the seeds might not be sprout until my children's generation, my grandchildren's generation. It may be quite longer, and taking that long view is very possible. If someone has no faith or is secular, but it's challenging to do those things. So having the long view, thinking that there's something greater than ourselves that's very tangible and available to help us are very powerful ways of not only helping someone make meaning, but also make meaning in community. And making meaning in community is what's really something like Humanity Rising is about, helping build a community together. How do we cohere? How do we persevere? And how do we make meaning out of not only our successes, but our suffering, and then understand that and be able to say, we're able to gather together to solve the poly crisis, and sort of feel maybe there's a hand on the scale of justice and goodness that's helping us out. I actually asked Rabbi Kat about this yesterday, is that some people might say that's really wonderful, but is it a placebo effect? And I think what I think from the people we're hearing from this week is that it's not just a placebo effect. It's not just a good thing, that a belief in God is a pro-social activity, that there's something more to it. What that something more is, we'll explore this week. But I think that what's interesting is that we're trying to create space to have a conversation about a future of God that's not the past. That's not about empire. It's not about oppressive religions. It's not about medieval theology. It understands modernity, understands post-modernity. And can someone live we're almost in the second quarter of the 21st century. What's the role of God? What's the role of religion in helping us to make meaning, to build a better world, and to create and to solve address the poly crisis? So with that, Tom, can you please introduce our wonderful guest today?
Yeah, Michael Nagler, delighted to have you with us today. If you want to join us on screen.
I think I just did, Tom.
Well, I'm especially delighted to have you here today, because when we think about the future of God, it's important that we understand the history of God. And I think you're uniquely positioned to not only help us understand the history, but also the future. And as you and I joked a week ago, in the last, more than a century ago now, Nietzsche declared that God was dead, and in 1900, God declared Nietzsche was dead. And so I very much welcome your thoughts and comments and perspectives on the role that God has played throughout the last 1,000 years or so in organized religion and in society at large, and how we hold God today, and whether it's through your experience as the former department chair of religious studies at UC Berkeley, or your personal journey. Love to hear your perspective. So welcome, and delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Tom. Very kind of you, but also a bit challenging. I'd like to make a brief comment before I begin. That reminds me of, I think it was Richard Nixon who got up one time and said, "Before I give my speech, I'd like to say something." But I would just like to comment on something that you said, Michael Putz. You said that there's something greater than ourselves. And I think the discovery of God in our era, as also in others, is that which is greater than ourselves is within ourselves. Not limited to within our private selves, but William Law was a mystic of the early 18th century, I believe, or maybe even earlier in Britain. He said, "Though God is everywhere present, he is only present to us in the inmost being of our soul." And that leads me to I want to comment on the future of God as a concept, and then into some thoughts, which I hope will not last very long, and then we can get into dialogue. But I did want to say, and I think you'll understand that this is like a friendly amendment, that the future of God is an absurdity. For God, by definition, there is no past, there is no future. Everything is just what Swami Chinmayananda called the threshold of the present. He said, the threshold of the present is where the future becomes the past. It's a very narrow area in which we try to remember, but for God, it is infinity, nothing less. So, but the topic is not absurd, because what it really means is, and you've already articulated this, Michael, what is the future, the present, and the future, and okay, Tom, partly the past, of the human relationship to God, which means what are our belief systems and what are our practices. And because of the tremendous importance of this aspect of human experience, because of the amount of passion that it generates, how do we keep this particular area of human experience out of the clutches of egoism and violence? Because as I was writing yesterday in correspondence with my friend Jonathan Kutab, who is a Palestinian lawyer, a lot of passion and desire to cling accumulates around nationalities. It's France against Germany, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now you have India against Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera. Even more around questions of race, as you were just referencing, George Floyd, and most of all around questions of religion. So I thought I would share by introducing an important theory in the science of religion. It's called Nagler's theory of religion. And according to Nagler's theory, religions evolve through 3 stages. And I'm saying this on the basis of my expertise, such as it was in ancient religions, especially in Greece and Rome, that the criterion that we're using here to delineate these stages is, where do the religionists, the people in that community, where do they think God is? Where is God to be found? Following the lead of William Law. And it seemed to me that the first stage is where God is found in nature, in the external environment. And this perfectly valid approach. They all are equally valid at their respective time frames. And this is still found today in a number of communities, civilizations around the world. I'm not talking about cargo cults, but belief that, God is that, as Dylan Thomas said, the green fuse that drives the flower drives my green need. In other words, the one single driving life force which has driven evolution and is driving my groping towards consciousness is one and the same force. So according to Nagler's theory, which we should all familiarize ourselves with, the first stage is to find God in the external world. The second stage, historically speaking, in most cultures, seems to have been to find God in the community. And there we find, for example, in the ancient culture that I studied the most, a city called Athens, and it had what we call an eponymous deity called Athena. And she represented for the people the essence, the life force of their community, which was the organizational framework at that point was called a polis or a city-state. And they built a magnificent temple to her in the highest part of the city, which you can still see today. A lot of it is still standing. And they had a colossal statue of Athena with a humongous bronze shield. And it is said that sailors 20 miles out to sea could see the sun glinting off that shield. And I'm emphasizing this because it showed how the concept of God and the searching for God at this stage of human evolution kind of crystallized around the sense that we are all Athenians. We are in this together. And actually, in the ancient religion, they didn't really call the city Athens. They called it the Athenians, Athenae. It was the people and their consciousness and their belief, which more than, and one of the Greek philosophers, Heraclitus, said, if we're going to struggle to survive, we have to struggle for our laws, our institutions, and not for our buildings, not for our walls. So that's the second stage. Guarantee you this isn't going to last too much longer. And the third stage is where God is sought within the consciousness of the individual human being. And while these are somewhat on one trajectory, these are historical, and you see what we sometimes call primitive religions looking for God in external nature, then more advanced religions looking for God in the community, and then finally someone like Socrates looking for God within himself. And that this is a necessary and almost inevitable evolution. So one question is, what stage are we at right now? And I would say, this is partly because of the meaning problem that I referred to earlier. We're at all of them. We've got people scattered all over the map, and there's a lot of misunderstanding and failure to achieve a common meaning framework because people are at different stages. And so what does that say about the future? Well, it kind of determines which of these three concepts is going to prevail. And a better way of putting that is, how can we set up a funnel such that the humanity, our consciousness rises from a recognition of beauty and meaning in the external world, which should get you a Nobel Prize in physics, to the recognition of beauty and meaning in the communal world, which can get you a presidency, God forbid, and finally the recognition of God within the human being, which gets you to a Gandhi. And one of the things that we want to avoid in all of this, and I don't think this is a big problem for much of our audience, is dualities, because dualities shrink this evolutionary process into a us versus them, into a black, white, yes, no. And a good example of that as to showing it at its worst, and Christianity has tended to be kind of susceptible to falling into this trap of duality. When I was doing comparative literature at Berkeley, one of the really big, exciting fields was medieval literature, and one of the documents that we all loved was called the Song of Roland, which of course was a war epic. There's just nothing but war. And in that epic, the Song of Roland, which was composed in the 12th century about a battle that happened in the 9th century in the Pyrenees, the Christian soldiers are on their horses fighting off pagans, namely Muslims. And these pagans, according to Christian imagination, are running around saying, Apollo, Apollo. In other words, all pagans are lumped together as pre-Christian Greeks. And the phrase that really struck me, that crops up again and again in the poem, is Les chrétiens ont droit, les païens ont tort. Christians are right, pagans are wrong. It's that simple. So India, on the other hand, has been rather good at avoiding this dualistic thinking and thinking of the consciousness within the human individual as more of a hierarchy, stages of growth, and similarly in history. So what we want to do, I think, is to bring back religion from the stuckness in dualism to a growing, emerging trajectory of growth through stages. And how are we going to do that? What is going to kind of kick the cycle over again so that we can rediscover a religion of the individual? Well, one thing is, and the main thing really, is the discovery of spirituality as the core of religion. In the first stages of religion, as I say, you look for it in the outside world, then the communal world, and then you look within yourself and you discover a need for growth. And making that more available for people to discover that need and to actually discover a way of growing in it, fulfilling it, is really what we need. And fortunately, spirituality is becoming more obvious. A lot of it is, of course, misunderstood, but a lot of it is not. And one development that I like to point to as potentially very hopeful that we really have not exploited yet, don't like to use that term, but we really haven't developed it to its fullness, is postmodern science. It's kind of boring term, but the idea of, for example, we can now speak. Even scientists, you can speak and not be thrown out of the hall about something called non-local consciousness. Is that consciousness exists above and beyond, way above and beyond, unlimitedly above and beyond that consciousness which is operating in, say, my individual being right now. And that consciousness is not limited in space or time. So what Einstein discovered about material reality is what Max Planck said, even more true of non-material reality, which has created this appearance of a material reality. And within this development of discovery of non-local consciousness and the importance of spirituality, there's one highly practical feature which has kind of become my my dharma, if you will, the path of my life. And to illustrate that, with your indulgence, I'm going to read, if I may, a rather long quote, and then finally shut up. And this quote is by a Palestinian Christian pastor in Bethlehem, whose name is Munter Isaac. And he was interviewed recently in a journal called The Christian Century. Kind of don't like the sound of it, but never mind. And in their October 2024 issue, they interviewed him, and he said the following. Right now, my energy is focused on how we can end this apartheid using creative and nonviolent resistance. It may sound naive and out of touch to talk about nonviolence today as a Palestinian, given the intensity of violence we are subjected to, but I cannot give up on my belief that the Jesus way is that of nonviolence. And then he focuses that a little bit. He says, anti-Semitism is real and it has existed for a long time, especially in the West. And I would argue that the Western world didn't ever deal inwardly with that racism. What you did instead was export the problem to Palestine and to blame us for it. The West tried to redeem itself at our expense, even to the extent of offering Palestinians as a sacrifice on the altar of repentance. Since you never had to pay for your sin of anti-Semitism, I don't think you ever internalized the process of repentance. The Western world, or at least much of it, hasn't dealt with the problem of racism and supremacy inwardly, with confession, with humility. The West hasn't paid for it. We Palestinians paid for it instead, and we're still paying for the redemption, for the guilt, if you will, of anti-Semitism in Europe. That's a hard reality, I think, for us to deal with. But, humanity doesn't rise unless it struggles with the problems at hand. And this is certainly a very big one. And it certainly is coming to its fullest expression in Gaza today. There's much more to be said about that conflict, but I don't think this would be the place for it. But it is quite similar to what you like to say, Tom, following Gabor Mate, about the failure to process an immense national trauma, which, because it isn't processed, it then expresses itself in a raw form and causes a great deal of suffering. So it's suffering recycling itself instead of spiraling upwards into what Pastor Isaac says, repentance and what does he say? Redemption.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Michael. It it certainly struck a chord with the folks in the chat. I've been watching the chat, and people are responding to what you've shared and what he wrote or stated as truth. It's hard to accept, it's hard to take in, and yet it's the reality of where we are and the stuckness that we have. And it's a origin that I hadn't appreciated until this moment.
Yeah. Glad it's of help, Tom.
Well, thank you, Michael.
Certainly.
I really appreciate that. One of the things we talked about in our first week is that we said that I appreciate, we understand the irony of the future of God. It's an ironical title, right? So we understand that is that it's really it's the evolution of our participation with God, sometimes. And I think what you were talking about, that funnel, you're talking about the three different stages of humanities, from nature to community to interior.
Yeah.
And you're talking about the need for a film, right? It reminds me of Kohut. I mean, he did the stages of faith, the different stages of faith. And my own process, and I think I don't think this is academic knowledge or like, oh, isn't that neat? I think it's essential knowledge. I think this is essential knowledge, because what happens is humanity, first of all, most of human history, we lived a hyper-local life. Most people didn't go more than 10 miles away from where they were home, or certainly didn't go beyond their nation state. It would be extremely rare for someone to do that. So, by the lack of fossil fuel powered mobility, we didn't get in contact with each other very much for most of human history. And so it would make sense that we would develop these kind of idiosyncratic beliefs, and we would reconcile them within our communities. But now we're smashed together by globalism and fossil fuels and technology, and we were never prepared for that, to have extremely strange beliefs from different people who were at different beliefs at different stages of that process, and it just mashes up together, and it's really difficult. And part of the difficulty is that also is the global mashup, but also we usually did not have people in different stages. Usually a culture was in a one dominant stage, and now we have people who, depending upon if your stage development framework you talked about in the East, some of the Great Eastern traditions, when they were doing monastic Buddhism, which I wanted to sort of say, people talk about Buddhism and Christianity, and I'll say, like, Buddhism, if I have to separate monastic Buddhism from lay Buddhism, which is like night and day, they're just, one of them is much more animistic, much more, nature, religion, and one is other. The monastic Buddhism would have many gradations of the levels of consciousness one develops through, sometimes quite fine, right? So that funnel you talked about in consciousness in the monastic process could be many, many stages of development that this community they viewed as objective, not subjective. That's things that the community, you have achieved this level of awareness, and then we can see it, and then there's another level you haven't seen yet, and we can see when you've gotten there. And it's a very disciplined process, right? And but the point is, the monastic Buddhists might have said, well, the person who's going to run this monastery has to be at this level of consciousness, and there might be many gradations of people through that process. A lay Buddhist wasn't doing that, right? We're just trying to live, have children, be a good community member. We're not too much fine-grained discussions. But what's interesting about the modern world is that we can have people who are at different stages living next to each other, right? Communicating next to each other. And if not living next to each other, finding each other on Facebook and social media, and then having mutual incomprehension, right? And so this is not an abstract conversation. And I discovered this sort of in the backwards way. Scott Peck wrote the book called The Road Less Traveled.
Yeah.
And he was talking about the fact that he was doing therapy, and he said something, his book became popular because he said something very radical, which he said, the center of successful psychotherapy is love, right? Right? And he said it was love first, love second, love third. It's love, right? That's for successful psychotherapy. And that was very radical. Eventually, it led him, as he was an atheist, led him to God eventually, because it's the ultimate source of love. But he was talking about this. But about love being the center of psychotherapy. But he also mentioned something else, which was his clients, the clients who came in, and then when they left, he noticed that his clients went through a characteristic process of evolution. If they had been fundamentalist, they came out as secular people. If they came in as secular and they had successful psychotherapy, they came out more open to mysticism. And if I'm thinking about your funnel, Michael, right? He was discovering the psychotherapy process that, one person's success was to leave religion and become autonomous. Another person's success was to leave autonomy and find the mystical connection with all. but it sounds suspiciously like your stages, Michael. You know what I'm saying? People are going through a process, and depending on where they were in that funnel, as you talked about, what their next step in discovering the ever-present God, right, was going to be different than somebody else's. Matter of fact, some people's next step was to leave their conventional, what you may have said, the community, the Athens vision, right, where they were leaving the idea of that their community's vision wasn't the only way they could connect with God, right? And I think that's so. Scott Peck was discovering that love was at the center. Love is the center of spirituality. Love is at the center of psychotherapy. But depending upon where those people were in their journey, their challenges were very different than someone else's challenges. Their next step of awareness was very different, and someone's next step was someone's past step, right? And the fact that we need to recognize that I would say, you are an elder in the best sense, and our culture doesn't have councils of elders anymore, where we say, can you share your wisdom, right, with us? And part of that wisdom is that I have been through a couple of stages of my own life, and I remember how much I would be an advocate for my stage of the developmental process, right? And I think what wisdom is that someone has gone through a couple of those stages in that funnel, and they can say, Michael, it's really great where you're at, and you're really enthusiastic about it, but not everybody gets where you are. Matter of fact, some people, the journey is where you're at, and you can speak to them. Other people, that's not their journey right now. They're more advanced than you are in their journey. Some people are earlier on in their journey, and that would have not been something I understood 30 years ago. I think I understand that quite well now, and I think someone like you, and from your experience, embodies that journey, right? So now you not only speak that journey, but you embody it. And that means people can hear you because they know that's who you are, right? But what's happened is that I think you're opening up a space with your conversation to say, look, we need to understand this process of spirituality isn't a one and done event. It's a journey that is not just an individual journey of exploration, but it goes through some universal stages. And that a lot of times we need to recognize that our fellow travelers are in different places in those stages. And that's really challenging at certain of those stages, because part of our certainty is that I'm here and everybody else should be there, right? And it's really difficult not to try to become an evangelist for that stage of development and to privilege that stage of development. And the only way, and it's completely understandable. And the only way to overcome that would be to have elders, true elders, who have been through all of those stages and can, with wisdom, help the whole community cohere and understand that people are in different places in that journey to the universal experience of God and spirituality. So that's what I took from your presentation today. That's what I found was being very heartening for me, and it fits with the theme that Tom and I had for the first week of session, saying that the future of God is participatory, it's relational, and it's developmental. It's developmental.
Yeah.
And I think you really beautifully brought that out today. I'm very thankful.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Well, gosh, I may not be an elder, but at least I'm old.
Well, a real elder always does the, oh, not me. Oh, not me. It's like the saints. The saints would always say that, the saints always said they were the greatest sinners. And they would never take any credit for it.
Well, I'll let my story speak for itself, but I had two comments in particular, Michael, on what you said. In one respect, you're in very good company, and you'll be glad to hear, because Immanuel Kant in 1795 wrote a very important essay called Zum ewigen Frieden, on perpetual peace. And he said that conflict was not a big group problem for us to deal with when we were scattered in such tiny communities. And of course, what he did not know, and what we have now recently discovered, very recently really, is that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals lived like a couple of weeks walk from one another for 50,000 years, 50,000 years, mind you, and never discovered each other for a long, long time. Later on, there was some interaction, but yeah, we didn't have to deal with this problem because we were so scattered. Now we have to because we're not. And so, that's the stage that we're at. That's the challenge that is before us. The other comment I wanted to make is Lawrence Kohlberg of Harvard had a theory of the stages of moral cognition, and I'm not sure that's exactly what he called it. And he identified 7 different stages of morality, which basically was, a funnel, if you will, from extreme individuality, from ex-President Trump on up towards true human beings. And one very useful thing that he pointed out about about these stages is that if, let's say I'm at stage 3 and you're at stage 5, I can't understand a word of what you're talking about. If I'm at stage 3 and you're at stage 4, I'll say, gosh, that's challenging and fascinating. So that again is a framework that might help us to understand the struggle of human beings to come to terms with one another and with the future, and what role does our spirituality and the concept of God play in that struggle, and how we can, as you said so well, tolerate and appreciate and learn from others who are at different stages.
Just picking up on the last comment, Michael, you referenced spirituality, and yesterday in our conversation we were talking with Rabbi Kat about mysticism and the role that mysticism plays. And Michael Putz and I have developed this week with a particular focus on mysticism, building off the last week. And I'm wondering if you would want to speak to the mystics and speak to mysticism and the role that it has to play in this conversation.
Yeah, good lead, Tom. Thank you. First of all, as a classicist, a recovering classicist, not to say something of a pedant, I'm going to talk about the term for just a second. It has a very interesting etymology. It comes from the Greek root myein, which means to close the eyes, to close down of some kind of sphincter or the eye muscles. And it's because when people became aware of an inner reality, they tended to lose awareness of outer reality. And it also went the other way around. You had to shut down your awareness of outer reality to become aware of inner reality. And there are 2 stories about Socrates that on very key occasions, one occasion he was bivouacked with an army. They were, I don't know, fighting the Thebans or something. And it was nighttime. He went out to go to the bathroom, answer the call of nature. And they found him there the next morning, standing with his eyes half closed. He'd been standing there all night long. He went into some kind of trance because precisely, and he said it precisely because he became aware of reality inside himself and immediately lost all interest in the fact that where he was going and where he was. And that also happened to him another time on the way to a dinner party, that he didn't show up, and he didn't show up, and the guests were wondering, where the heck is he? And they went outside, he was standing in front of the door. He had just, he reached that stage. So what a mystic is at best able to do is capture the awareness and I might add, the tremendous energy of what lies within us, and which is the inheritance of every human being. And just as with electrical energy or atomic energy, to build a transformer, if you will, to step it down so that it can be applied usefully in your personal life and in the development of human beings towards our ultimate destiny. And that's exactly, I think, what mysticism does. And perhaps the best example of this in modern times is really the best example of almost everything in modern times is Mahatma Gandhi, though he tended not to draw attention to it. And he had very good reasons for not drawing attention to it, because he would have been mischaracterized and mislabeled as someone who is not practical. Was there anyone in the 20th century more practical than Gandhiji? And yet all of that came from his mystical, if you will, awareness of, to use the scientific term I used earlier, of non-local consciousness. And I want to say one more thing about non-local consciousness, or emphasize rather, something I've said before, is that it's on that level of consciousness that we are one, that we are united. And it's because our culture, our materialist civilization has driven us down, driven our attention down to the lowest level of reality, physical reality, which we now have known for the last 120 years. It isn't even there. That we need to raise, as we raise our awareness from body to mind to consciousness, we enter a very rapidly expanding funnel, again, if you will, of unitary awareness of all of life. And fortunately, we have examples from the past, of course, like St. Francis or many, many others. And an example from a modern age, I was alive when Gandhiji was assassinated. So we in that sense overlapped. He comes right into our modern age. He was someone who had expanded his consciousness to embrace all of life. And his wife Kasturba was once asked by an American journalist who, like many journalists, was completely clueless, asked her, "How many children do you have?" And she said, "Well, that depends whom you ask. I have 4. My husband has 400 million," which was approximately the population of India at that time. But the one thing that people said about, well, actually 2 things, and this is very interesting. 2 things people said about Gandhi when they ever met him. They tended to say the first thing that struck them about that man was his incredible health. His health. He was just so vibrant and glowing with health. And the next thing, of course, which is closely related, was his great love, which extended to anyone and everything. Gosh, I'm sorry, Tom, I lost track of what we were talking about, and I just...
Oh, you didn't lose track at all. We were, talking about mysticism
Yeah.
and the role that it and the invitation that it offers humanity for the future.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing your thoughts there.
Very welcome.
Michael, I'll turn it over to you. Anything that's there for you and what you'd like to respond to what Michael just shared around mysticism and spirituality and Gandhi and
Well, it's very rich there. One of the things that I think we're sort of trying to feel our way towards is um, there's the challenge of mutual incomprehension of people being at many different stages, right? And the question is, how do we then bring that together? And so as they say, everyone's exactly where they should be, right? Everyone's in the journey where they're at. Now the challenge is that the West is very egalitarian, right? A Buddhist monastery is not very egalitarian at all. Absolutely not egalitarian. There is a hierarchy. It's not just of power and rank. It's a hierarchy it's like almost a spiritual meritocracy, right? And so they understand that there's different stages of development and even different stages of enlightenment, different levels of that. That can be ascertained, not arbitrarily, but in community. And I'm not trying to advocate for that. I'm just making an analogy here. And so the point is that the kind of wisdom that you've achieved, some people in the comments have mentioned, some people can be old and not very wise. Some people can be relatively young and quite wise. And that's part of the developmental process. Some people can develop. Yeah, and some people's, as they say, people peak in high school kind of thing, right? They don't keep growing. Some people keep growing. And the challenge is, well, everyone's where they're at, and it's beautiful and lovely because I was that myself. I can see all of those stages. I was that person who his consciousness was limited. I couldn't see beyond myself, and I was certain of it. And then there's a certain stage where we become aware of the process of evolution itself. We become aware of this unfolding process as a process. But oftentimes that awareness doesn't come until middle age or later. It happens with some people who are younger, but most time it doesn't happen until later. And that's why I talked about the importance of eldership, how critical that is. And that's something that in Western culture is, incredibly, that's a huge hole we have, genuine eldership that is of wisdom, because just because you're old doesn't mean, as you said before, you can find some people who support some politicians we talked about who they could be 80 years old, not very wise at all, as we said, right? But the eldership's very important, but also what Tom was trying to get at is this experience of direct communion with God. A lot of times, what was interesting, if you look at like the Christian tradition, there's this term called cessationism. And cessationism is basically, there's this argument, especially among the Protestants, about why is it that, because the Protestants had a reaction to Catholicism, because Catholicism seemed to have all this fusion of paganism and saints and this. It was a big, messy thing. There was the corruption of the church, but there was also all these saints and all these weird things going on. And the view of Protestantism was to say, to solve what they considered the accretion of occult ideas with Christianity and the corruption of the church is to basically just simply wash the church as white, get rid of all the statues, all the saints, all the stained glass windows, get rid of all of it, right? And what was interesting about that is that it got rid of, but then there was this problem is the early church was very messy. People were having miracles all the time. The Holy Spirit was working through people all the time. And the Holy Spirit was not working just through prophets, great people like Moses and stuff. It was the average person was having miraculous experiences. And one of the things the church struggled with, like the Protestant church especially, was how do we deal with the fact that all of our gospels are full of people having miracles, Jesus speaking in tongues and all these wonderful things, and they weren't happening in the present day. Mm-hmm. Why? And then what cessationism was basically saying that the profligacy of all these miracles was necessary to establish the church in its early days, sort of to get it planted. And once it was planted, then there was no need for them anymore. It ended when the apostles died. That was sort of the view of the church. And the reason I get into that was they were trying to reconcile why was everybody filled with the Spirit in the early days and so few people were filled with the Spirit in the modern day. And I think that one of the things that's interesting is that there's some kind of lesson in here that there was actually, it wasn't just isolated people. There was the Jesus movement, but before it became the Catholic Church and in the Roman Catholic Church. was people who were in direct communion with God, under persecution. They were being killed, they were slaves, and the poor were in the Jesus movement, and at great risk to their life, they were engaged in this process. And part of the reason that they persevered is because of they were having that communion you were talking about, an inner experience of God that was direct and tangible that sustained them in very difficult circumstances. And what's interesting is that wouldn't it be great if we could find a way for people to have that kind of broad participatory experience? It's not just for saints. It's not just for special people like Gandhi, but it would be something that many people can participate in a genuine way. An everyday, ordinary mysticism. And I think that's an interesting thing. I don't have an answer for that. I don't have a formula for that. If I did, I'd love to share with everybody. But is it possible in your mind that we could actually return to a time where we have an ordinary mysticism? I think Tom, you can maybe help me here, but I think we're sort of trying to feel around of, I use that Christian example, the first 100, 200 years of the church, they had ordinary mysticism that you could say is very tangible because the church grew and people were sustained through extreme persecution. Something was keeping them going, right? Something that was very alive within them, just like the vitality was in Gandhi, right? Gandhi had so much vitality because the spirit was alive in him. The early Christians, slaves were inspired by God within, just like we can see in modern days when people rose up against oppression. So I was wondering, do you think ordinary mysticism is possible for us now?
Well, if you're asking me, I know it's possible. Not because I made the final breakthrough, don't get me wrong, but I know that it is possible from my own experience and what I've learned. The question is, can it be established as a social phenomenon, social norm? And that depends on having a supportive culture. One thing that during the hippie days and the new agey kind of stuff that we were participating in the 60s, part of which was very right on, part of which was extremely off, which we were very jealous of the fact that in India there was a supportive culture, so that if you had mystical experience, people would know what to do with you. Whether they became your follower or not, there was at least a label for who you were. And my quarrel often with modern Christianity is that we don't really have I hope I'm not offending people here, but I often do. We don't really have a label, an accurate scientific understanding of who Jesus was. Therefore, we are forced into this hierarchical duality. Is he man or God? And people, kill themselves in large numbers just debating whether he was man or God. And because they did not have the experience of what we can simply call a God-realized person, a person who had broken through to higher consciousness and became incapable of hate and so forth. So I think from a historical point of view, and reading a lot in some of the people in the Jesus movement, that there was a relatively open and understanding model within first century Judaism, but it was rolled over like a big bulldozer by the Roman Empire. And this is, in other words, that the situation into which Jesus was born was very similar to the situation into which Gandhi was born. That is, they were both born in a supportive culture for spirituality, which they had benefited from, participated in, but a materialistic, militaristic culture was suppressing them. So it was a struggle not just for political liberation, that was the smallest part of it. It was a struggle for really the liberation of the human spirit. So the idea that a human being can grow and can manifest the divinity within him or her was being crushed by this material power in both cases. So, boy, history, really has repeated itself. And let's see, I wanted to share another three-stage hierarchy with you. That's what professors do. We talked about this hierarchy from the social point of view, but there's also, as I mentioned briefly, we are a hierarchy of body, mind, and spirit. And the question is, which part of us is going to predominate? In Vedanta, in the Hindu fold, they had another model for this, which overlays with this, and it is also very helpful, that there are really three tendencies in nature, including human nature. They are called tamas, the dark tendency of what I called earlier stuckness, and rajas, the middle tendency of intense energy without guidance, which is a lot of what we see in America today. I remember Marlon Brando in the film The Wild Ones, and they come roaring into town on the motorcycles and on their Harleys, and people say, "Where are you going?" And they say, "Well, we don't go places, man. We just go." That was the definition of rajas. And then sattva, which is guided, focused energy, which really brings the entire human capacity into play. So those are very useful models, I think, which enable us to identify where we are individually in our spiritual growth and where our culture is and where to look in our culture for support.
Yeah, picking up on that point in this conversation where I'm left is, with the poly crisis that we've been speaking to and the meaning crisis, there's certainly a potential that people are going to find their way to their version of God and mysticism out of fear. And there's also the invitation that they'll find that we will find ourselves there through love. And it's a choice point that each of us are needing to make. But
Yeah.
If we look through history, finding our way to God, however we experience it, however we define it, is the way through.
Yeah, the difficulty with it, or one of them, is that the minute we become aware of God, that by definition, it means becoming aware of God in each and every living being. And that means that our violence has been hideously wrong. And one thing that I've discovered in life is people cannot tolerate the concept that they were immoral. And it's important for us as change makers to recognize this, because we often have, like if I'm at stage 5 and someone's at stage 4, I have a tendency to rub his or her nose in it and say, "How come you're on such a low stage? You're no good," which is hugely counterproductive. So, yeah, I guess not sure totally where I'm going with this, but I'm particularly interested. I mean, my life path has concern with where the violence comes in and how you get people. Yeah, this is what I was getting at. How can we get people to abandon their violence without being stuck and wallowing in guilt. There's how can you repudiate what you just were and move on to something that you can become? And again, I think it's because we can only do this by developing a model of growth, which may have discernible stages or not, but we cannot do it with the dualities that we tend to see life in. I know one of my really good friends passed in 1983, Kenneth Boulding, was one of the founders of Peace Research, actually, and a wonderful guy, a Quaker. He talked about being in India, standing on a railway platform, and for a minute being confused and a bit overwhelmed by the enormous variety of people. Different skin colors, different clothing. You know, you have people walking around in Western business suits with laptops in their briefcase, and other people, you know, tottering on a staff in orange robes, and how everybody was comfortable with one another. And in a minute, he overcame his confusion, his disorientation, and became completely comfortable there. Whereas in certain other countries, which I will not mention, because I don't want to increase prejudice and violence, he stepped off a train in a very similar situation and felt very uncomfortable because everybody looked the same.
Mm.
And in my own life, I had a little experience of this. We had a chancellor at Berkeley who was very, very keen. Michael Heyman was his name. Those Michaels, they're always the leaders. And Mike Heyman was very keen on what was then called diversity. It called similar things today. He worked on it very hard for a year. And the following year, I went to the first meeting of my big class, which was a mythology class. And I walked into the lecture hall. There was about 150 people there. I walked into the lecture hall without necessarily looking at the students yet, put my books down, looked out over the crowd, and I felt so happy and so comfortable because like almost no two kids were alike. You know, they're every, you know, racial and cultural and educational mixture together. And I realized how uncomfortable I felt in a narrow, isolated environment, and which I had not realized while I was in it, because I said, "Oh yeah, I'm a part of this. This is me. I fit here." And then that breakthrough was to realize we will not be happy until and unless we feel that we're a part of everyone.
Mm. Well, I'd like to invite Jim back into our conversation as we close out today's broadcast. Welcome back, Jim.
Thank you, Tom. Michael, both Michaels, this has been a splendid conversation. I want to just explore, Michael, given the proximity to October 7th anniversary just yesterday, the remarks that you were making at the end of your opening presentation about the perspective that what's going on in the Middle East today is due to the refusal of the Christian Europeans to repent from anti-Semitism in the aftermath of what took place with generally the Second World War, but specifically the Holocaust, because I think that's a very profound insight and understanding that I've had for many, many years. But it's been very difficult to talk about it because normally people respond in a kind of an allergic way and charge me with being anti-Semitic when it's not anti-Semitic at all. It's seeking to understand what is in fact going on. So I want to open that up because I think this is a profound contextual framework for understanding what's going on, because the people that endured the genocide at the end of the Second World War, before, during, and at the end of the Second World War, are now being accused of doing the same thing there. And I think there's a linkage between the two. And the world then, and the US and the Israelis and the Europeans now, are not owning up to the deeper reality of racism and colonialism, and I would say white Aryan Jewish supremacy over the other races. So I want to just deepen that and get you to initially comment on my remarks, and then I have a few other aspects that I would like to bring up because what we're seeing is history repeating itself with the same mindlessness, the same rationalization, the same propaganda. And if you don't learn from history, you're condemned to repeat it. So loved to have your comments.
Wow, how seldom people love to have my comments. Let me make two comments here, Jim. First is that Gandhi, whom I've referenced so often, was very concerned about the formation of the State of Israel 75 years ago, because he correctly saw that there were two serious problems with it, that the West was trying to offload its Semitism instead of dealing with it, which was what Rabbi Isaac was talking about. And secondly, that it was a form of severe anti-Semitism to do what they did, because they said it's a land without people, and they just pushed the Palestinians over, the way we push the indigenous people. So again, history, every time history repeats itself, this is the other thing I wanted to add, and I bet you wholeheartedly agree, it gives us another opportunity to learn from it. And it's going to keep on repeating until we learn. So it's a hard kind of grace that we've been given, that God won't let us go until we learn our lesson. The lesson that all consciousness is one, and that all human beings are equally valid. And as one of the scholars whose insight has been very helpful for me in all of this was René Girard, who was an expert on ancient sacrifice.
Yes.
And how he showed that we are constantly trying to offload our guilt, our problems onto
the
scapegoat, literally.
Yes.
And scapegoat, you're going to load all your sins on the poor goat that had nothing to do with it. And send it out to the wilderness. Or you say, thank God. The goat would say, I don't have to deal with those humans anymore. But the biggest case of a problem that humanity as a whole, as cultures, societies, has not solved, is this tendency to offload our difficulties, our enmity, onto others. And the saving of us can only come through mysticism, which says, no, friend, the problem is within you. And until and unless you deal with it there, you will never be able to solve it in the outside world because you can't deal with a problem that's not there. And it's first and foremost, it has to be dealt with within us. And in cultural terms, that means having a supportive culture that would enable people to develop spiritually, higher and higher awareness of greater and greater number of being one, and making that, actually using that as the template for how society ought to be. We haven't really spoken about that very much, but you used the term, Michael, as spiritual meritocracy, which I suppose will work. But
So I think Jim and Michael, there's something that I was listening to your conversation about the three stages of, Thomas and Rajas and Sattva, and you're saying like we get to this idea, this guided, this one of the barriers towards a higher stages of mysticism is when we realize our oneness with all, then we realize that they're not other, but also the pain of others. And that's very difficult to process, which is what have I done in this lifetime, but also ancestrally. And what's important about this is that how do we do this without feeling overwhelmed? And I mean, we can look at these religions as backwards, or we can look at them as saying they were trying to deal with a real problem and they were trying to come up with solutions. And we haven't come up with good solutions to deal with not only our personal guilt or our debt to others, but our ancestral guilt or our collective guilt. And I think a way forward that I would just bookmark for a future conversation is, I think, we know most people here have heard of Thomas Heubel's work on collective trauma. And Thomas Heubel, I think, is a masterful person because he comes from Germany, right? He talks about talk about a field of collective trauma, right? 2 world wars that they suffered as well. Now, it may have been because of their own acts, but, they were devastated through 2 world wars and a Great Depression, and then they committed great crimes, right? And then there's also a collective sense of wanting to make good on this. The Germans have a lot of guilt, right? The problem is that it's so crushing and overwhelming that Thomas Heubel said we need to work on this as collective fields of trauma. And it seems to be part of the magic here, part of the thing that unlocks this process, the repetition and offloading, is that it's so overwhelming. It's so powerfully overwhelming for the individual. It's their own collective shame and guilt, but also the collective trauma around us that we don't even acknowledge, right? We act as if we're all individual selves and we're steeped in these fields. And some people say it's too much. And you know what? It's too much if there's not a supportive process of processing this trauma. Even if my ancestors or I wasn't a perpetrator, my community, I was part of a community of perpetrators, right? And I think most of us can say we have some linkage to that. And sometimes it's difficult to open up to the beauty of spirit because we think we'll also be open up to all of that hidden pain at the same time. It's rather close the door to the light because I feel so much pain of the trauma. And then we can understand with compassion why people offload, because they don't even know what they're feeling. And I think what Thomas Heubel does, and he's a remarkable human being, is that he just sits there with so much compassion and then has people do the work, but so much compassion and saying, this is a process for me, my family, my community, multiple generations, right? And that process opens up the door to this kind of profound healing. This is a profound healing process. And I've seen Thomas Heubel trying to do this with the German people, with the Holocaust, but he's been doing a lot of work in Israel and Palestine well before October 7th, right? Because of these processes he's repeating there. And so I don't, it's Thomas Heubel's work is it stands alone. It doesn't have to relate to any theism or any particular religion, but I think they're very closely related to being able to open the door of processing the collective trauma that I think holds a lot of us back, because If I open up the door to spirit, I open up the door to all of that repressed trauma too, and we're afraid of it, so we close it off. And does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, 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 it makes sense. And I think that we can't face our collective or our individual guilt
Mhm.
until and unless we become aware that there is an absolutely untouched, unspoiled spirit within us. And we can base ourselves in that and then confront the failures of the expression of that spirit in the outside world. I know shortly after the war, I know I'm dating myself. Shortly after the war, there were films. And in one of these films, a high-ranking Nazi officer was quoted as saying, and he was, the background of this is Hitler saying that this was a 1,000-year Reich. This empire would last 1,000 years. He said, dieser Schuld Deutschland wird dauern für 1,000 Jahre. That this guilt of Germany is going to last for 1,000 years. And I said, no, no, I don't want you to suffer like that. And later on, I came to understand that wallowing in being stuck in that suffering, and the worst thing that you can do is identifying that as who you are. So I think personally, it was a huge release for me because I had been trapped in so much hate and fear against those people, and then suddenly to contact them as people suffering and to actually have this upwelling of empathy for them. It was tremendously healing for me personally, but it also was a big breakthrough in my understanding. And it took really years for me to complete that circle and to realize that unless I can be convinced that there is this untouched, sublime spirit within me, it will be very, very difficult for me to own any of the moral failures that I have been responsible for on the outside, outer shell of that experience. And I can't be aware of that inner reality if I think it's my private possession. I have to simultaneously be aware that absolutely everyone has that same brilliance and unstained purity within them. Wow. The minute that I said that, a large flock of blackbirds took off from the bush outside the window.
Good omen.
A good one. Yeah.
I know we're pushing the time envelope here, but I want to ask you one more question, Michael, that comes out of the preface that Carl Jung wrote for the book, The Secret of the Golden Flower, that Richard Wilhelm translated. And this was Jung late in life after the Second World War, in which he made, I thought, a very profound comment about the distinction between the Abrahamic religions in the West and the Asian religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, in the East. And he said, and this was also by way of understanding the violence that had taken place in Western civilization, not only the anti-Semitism, but the colonialism and the Crusades and so forth and so on, that are pretty conspicuously absent in the Eastern world, which is not to say, as he put it, that violence doesn't exist, but the levels of violence in the West are far in excess to anything one finds in Asia, which is more naturally nonviolent in its basic orientation. And the reason, he said, and this is where I'd like to have your comment, He said, in the East, the polarities of yin and yang are encased within the unity of the Tao.
Mhm.
So everything that takes place within the Eastern spiritual and religious traditions is contained within a fundamental monism, a fundamental sense of pantheism, that it is all one, that God and the universe are all intermixed in a totality, and therefore there's a natural sense of tolerance and a natural sense of respect. He said that in the West, in the Abrahamic religions, there's no overarching unity principle. There's no sense of the Tao. You have God on as creator, and the creation is separate from. You have sort of the chosen people and those who are not chosen. In Christianity, the elect and the damned. So that you have that yin and yang polarity, but because you don't have an overarching sense of unity, the religions of the Western world have ended up as they've ended up, right? With the Holocaust and colonialism, and because everything is always couched as the other.
Mhm.
So that obviously is Jung's position is more detailed and complex than that, but that's the general framework that he articulates in that preface in The Secret of the Golden Flower. And I would just love to have your comments on this as we close, because oftentimes we say they're all the same. They're all about love. But Jung took the position that actually they're not. There are fundamental differences between them that we need to acknowledge, and not to do so is a contributes to our current predicament.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Jim. I guess a couple of comments. One, in terms of the geographical, historical realities in the world, I think Jung's distinction is useful, but we have to recognize that it's a matter of degree. And, there's been plenty of violence in the East. Sometimes it hasn't been as well organized or as highly technological as it has in the West. So it looks
Absolutely.
like
Absolutely. And he
looks
would
like
acknowledge
well,
that.
yeah. And the other point I wanted to make, and we kind of deal with this at the Metta Center all the time, and that's where we create materials to facilitate this kind of thinking, is that the very fact that some individuals have risen above these limitations and made these breakthroughs, we should take as telling us that we can do it also. And when we do that,
Good point.
because they were just, body, mind, and spirit like us. And the second point is to recognize that this is not they're not pointing the finger of blame at us for not having done it yet. What they're doing is creating a goal. Gandhi really expressed this very well, that it's critically important for us to have a shining figure, an individual, a society, what have you, as something that we can be growing towards, that we're in flux, we're not stuck in a particular category. And if I'm many, many times less than, one of these great signposts in the future, I am not to feel, oh, how come I'm so far behind? But rather, wow, this shows my potential.
Mm.
And when I cultivate that attitude, then I don't have a problem with people who have some kind of advantage. And of course, if they try to exploit that advantage, it means that automatically they don't really have it. So that's another question. But I think Americans, in their egalitarianism, which has led to tremendous amount of hierarchy, paradoxically enough. I, I think we have actually deprived ourselves of the ability to identify a shining goal.
Beautifully put.
Yeah.
Beautifully put.
And that really held us back.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, thank you, Michael. Tom, Michael, do you either or both of you want to tee us up for tomorrow, and then we'll bring this to a close?
Well, I just want to thank Michael Nagler for being here today. It was really beautiful. And there's just so much more about creating a supportive culture for mysticism, for eldership, for helping develop compassion for people being at different stages of the journey. And how can we create a container, as you talked about, Jim, that surrounds the yin and yang, that creates the greater context for all this? You know, I threw in the idea of Thomas Heubel's trauma healing at a collective level as being something that creates a supportive structure for this process. And the idea of, I think, you know, as Tom will wrap up here, about some of the educational efforts you're doing, Michael. I think we should talk about it briefly as well and let people know about. But this is such a rich subject, I think almost deserves more conversations. But I'm really grateful to be here today. Thank you.
You'll just have to convene another week, Michael. This is such rich stuff. This is such rich material. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael, for being with us today. Thank you, Michael, for helping to organize this week. And just invite everyone to join us again tomorrow. We're delighted to have Father Jostrom Kurithodum from the Pontifical University in the Vatican joining us to provide his perspective on the future of God. And look forward to another engaging program and dialogue. So thank you all. Thank you, Jim, for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Michael, you have a final comment?
If you all don't mind, I mean, I'm really preserving on your open-mindedness here. If I could put in another plug, that the Metta Center has a beautiful film that we make available, and a lot of other resources. And the only thing you need to remember is that Metta has 2 T's. That's your key.
And on that happy note, you're all welcome to join us in the after chat. You'll see the link in the chat box. You receive the after chat link in your Zoom reminders for today, and then we'll see you all again tomorrow for our 3rd of 5 sessions on the future of God. Thanks so much. Thank you, Michael.
All.
You well. Bye-bye.